Hi, my story today is called Love Online at Intermediate Level. It's all about Tinder and the things that can go wrong. I'd love to know what you think about it, so please leave me a comment at the end. If you want to receive more stories, please don't forget to subscribe. Love Online, written by Liz Plampton. Lizzie had been learning how to speak French for 2 years, and she thought by now she would be fluent. But she was not making very good progress. The French language was more difficult than she thought it would be. Despite all her efforts, it seemed like she would never be able to speak it fluently. She just couldn't remember all the grammar and vocabulary. What I really need, she said to herself, is a French friend I could practice conversation with. Lizzie sighed and walked home in the dark, wet, suburban streets of Croydon in South London. Lizzie was a bit of a loner. She was quite shy and kept herself to herself. She didn't like going out much because she didn't really enjoy meeting new people. In fact, she only had one friend and she was called Sarah. One day, Sarah suggested that she should try the dating app Tinder to find a partner. But Lizzie was absolutely horrified at the idea. She'd never even heard of Tinder. "But everyone's doing it now," said Sarah. "My mum even does it, ever since she split up with my awful stepdad. There really is a God. All you have to do is sign up with a nice photo of yourself, what your hobbies are, and say what sort of person you'd like to meet." "But I'm not interested in meeting anyone at the moment," said Lizzie shyly. Secretly, Lizzie had always dreamed of meeting her perfect man at the top of the Eiffel Tower. But since she'd never summoned up the courage to go to Paris on her own, it had always remained a dream. At home now, Lizzie settled down to some pot noodles and her favourite French crime series on Netflix called Spiral. Halfway through, Lizzie started thinking about what her friend Sarah had said about Tinder. "Everyone's doing it," Sarah's voice echoed in her head. So Lizzie grabbed her mobile and began to Google Tinder, just to find out what it was all about. After some time and lots of thinking, Lizzie eventually signed up and found herself scrolling through a variety of prospective partners. It was just to have a look, she told herself. She certainly wouldn't be contacting anyone. After 20 minutes, she began to feel a little disheartened. She hadn't found a single person she felt attracted to or would like to meet. "All I want is a tall, dark, handsome man with a good sense of humour," she shouted out loud. Then all of a sudden, "Wow!" cried Lizzie. "This is the one! Not only was he incredibly cute, but he was French too." Romantic French conversation flashed through Lizzie's mind as she imagined them both together at the top of the Eiffel Tower. Before she knew it, she had swiped right. "Oh my goodness," she thought. "What have I done? He could be an axe murderer." But a French axe murderer, she thought. Lizzie finished her now cold pot noodles and went to bed feeling excited and nervous at the same time. The next morning, as soon as she opened her eyes, Lizzie checked her phone for a reply from her Frenchman. but there was nothing. In fact, Lizzie was checking her phone all day at work for any replies, but there was still nothing. By the time she got home, she had decided to forget about Pierre and made herself a cheese and pickle sandwich. She didn't feel like cooking anything. As Lizzie was preparing her sandwich, she heard a ping on her phone. "I expect it's nothing," she thought, and carried on buttering the bread. "But it might be him," said a little voice in her head. She couldn't hold out any longer and ran over to her phone that was lying on the floor next to the sofa. Her hands were trembling now as she opened the message, and there it was, right in front of her very eyes. Pierre had replied. Lizzie squealed with delight. "He wants to meet me. He wants me to go to Paris to meet him." Without a second thought, Lizzie replied, "Yes, I'd love to meet you. Where exactly would you like to meet?" Pierre replied, "On the Pont de Lena, on the River Seine. How about next Tuesday at, say, 3 p.m? Lizzie, sounds perfect. See you then." Before she knew it, Lizzie was on the plane flying to Paris, on her own, to meet her gorgeous Frenchman. "I'll be wearing a red rose in my buttonhole and carrying a copy of Le Monde newspaper," Pierre had told her. When Lizzie stepped off the plane, her legs felt like jelly and her palms were sweating. She was seriously thinking of catching the next flight home. "How stupid I am! What on earth was I thinking? Who am I trying to fool? He won't be interested in me." The words kept going round and round in her head. This carried on until she reached her hotel, where she checked in. "Bonjour, madame." Liz felt a moment of joy as soon as she heard that wonderful French accent. "But bonjour," she replied rather shyly. Lizzie immediately felt a lot better, and her confidence began to return. The room was very basic. It was the cheapest she could find on TripAdvisor, but at least it was clean, she thought, as she began unpacking her case. She took out the red dress she was going to wear. She hadn't planned to wear anything special. After all, she didn't want to appear too eager, but Sarah had persuaded her to wear something a little bit cheeky. "Go on," said Sarah. "It's my lucky dress. He won't be able to take his eyes off you." "Do you really think so?" replied Lizzie, beginning to warm to the idea of borrowing the dress from Sarah. She certainly couldn't afford to buy anything new, and she didn't like buying too many clothes to help save the environment. "Okay," Lizzie said. "You've persuaded me." "Great," said Sarah. "Here, take it. But take care of it," she laughed. At the hotel, Lizzie looked at herself wearing the dress in the small mirror inside the wardrobe door. It didn't look as good as it did when she tried it on in Sarah's bedroom. "Oh dear," she thought. "Well, it'll just have to do." So with a deep breath, she opened the door and left the room, striding down the corridor. "It's do or die," she said to herself. Outside the hotel, Lizzie was feeling anxious again. The street was full of people and tourists from all over the world, some rushing by, some wandering along slowly, admiring the scenery. Lizzie had never been on her own in a big city before. She looked down at her feet. She had bought some shoes from a charity shop to match the dress, but they were beginning to feel uncomfortable. "I hope my feet last out in these shoes," she thought. They were a bit tight and much higher than the ones she usually wore. She looked at her phone. She had put the route into Google Maps. She began walking, and within 10 minutes she was approaching the bridge. She slowed down, feeling a bit sick. She had plenty of time to spare, as she had left earlier to make sure she got there on time. She didn't want to leave anything to chance. But the feeling of wanting to run 1,000,000 miles away had returned. It was only her shoes that were stopping her. As she stepped onto the bridge, she turned her ankle, and a searing pain travelled up her leg. She stumbled, unable to control herself, but managed to grab the metal rail at the side. "Oh my goodness! How embarrassing! I feel such a fool," she thought as she tried to smile bravely to the world through gritted teeth. "I must look so stupid," she thought. She looked up to make sure Pierre hadn't already arrived and seen her fall. But too late! There, with his hand outstretched to help her up, was Pierre. She knew it was him because she noticed the red rose in his buttonhole. It looked ridiculous, actually. And then she spotted a newspaper lying on the ground, which must have slipped out from under his arm. His face, on the other hand, didn't quite match his photo on Tinder. His mane of jet black hair seemed to have disappeared almost completely. Instead, all that remained was a receding hairline, showing most of his forehead. And even worse, he had squeezed the remaining hair into a little pigtail, which was sitting on the crown of his head. Lizzie had noticed all this in seconds, before taking his hand and apologising profusely for being so clumsy. "I'm so sorry. I don't normally have accidents," Lizzie said shyly. "No problem," said Pierre, in what didn't sound like a French accent at all. "Let's find a place to sit down," he said. Lizzie's head was spinning now as Pierre led her to a quiet place along the river. Her ankle felt better, and they began with the usual small talk. "How was your journey?" said Pierre. "Okay," said Lizzie. "I've never been to Paris before. How long have you been living here?" "A couple of years now," said Pierre. "What about you?" "Oh, I live in Croydon. It's not as beautiful as Paris. You are very lucky," said Lizzie. It was beginning to get dark, and Lizzie felt rather disappointed. Pierre was not a Frenchman after all. His father was, which is why his father had given him a French name. Pierre was brought up in Yorkshire, in the north of England. He had only spent the last 4 years in Paris, living with his father. But the worst thing was, he had a Yorkshire accent, something that Lizzie had never been fond of. Lizzie was about to make her excuses and leave, when Pierre pointed up at the Eiffel Tower and said, "Have you ever been?" "No," said Lizzie, looking up. "But I've always wanted to." Said Pierre. "I definitely recommend it. The best time is at night, when there's no one else around." Lizzie laughed. half thinking how ridiculous he was being, and half wondering if he was being serious. "I can arrange it if you like," he said. "How?" said Lizzie, not believing him. "I work there. I'm a security guard, so I can go there any time I like," smiled Pierre. Lizzie looked at Pierre. For the first time during the evening, she noticed how his dark eyes sparkled in the light. She noticed how strong he looked, with his rippling muscles bulging from under his t-shirt. Lizzie shivered with excitement. She began to smile, and her whole body began to relax. Their eyes met, and Lizzie felt herself unable to move. Suddenly, everything made sense to her, and before she knew it, she had moved in for a kiss. Lizzie heard her phone ping in her bag, but she didn't care. Whoever it was could wait. This was her moment, and this was meant to be. She could always cut off his pigtail anyway. But unfortunately, what Lizzie didn't know was that it was in fact Pierre who was messaging her. The real Pierre. The one who she had originally arranged to meet on Tinder. He was messaging her because he wanted to apologize for not turning up. He had been delayed at the hospital because he had to perform an emergency operation on an elderly man suffering from liver failure. Oh dear. Perhaps if Lizzie hadn't been so shy and unquestioning of this man, she might have realized he was not the Pierre she thought he was. She had assumed it was Pierre because of the rose in his buttonhole when they met on the bridge. She didn't question why he wasn't carrying a copy of Le Monde newspaper, because she thought he had dropped it on the bridge. So, I hear you ask, who is this Pierre? The one she is now slowly walking hand in hand with into the dark night. Is he really just a security guard looking for romance? Or is he an axe murderer? Who knows, as Lizzie walks towards her La Tour Eiffel. If you want to receive more stories, please don't forget to subscribe.